Rain lashed against the windows of the American hospital in Paris on a gray, miserable day in March 1975. Inside a sterile, quiet room, a man lay dying. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His eyelids were taped open with adhesive strips because the muscles in his face had collapsed, leaving him unable to lift them on his own. To the nurses who changed his sheets, he was just another old man fading away in the darkness. But to the world, this shattered figure was a titan. He was the Golden Greek. He was the man who had bought an airline, married the most famous woman on the planet, and amassed a fortune so vast it was difficult to comprehend. He was Aristotle Onassis. Just a few years prior, this man had possessed everything a human being could possibly desire. He owned private islands, fleets of supertankers, and priceless art. He dined with Churchill and argued with princes. Yet, in these final hours, the silence in the room was deafening. His only son was dead. His daughter was estranged. His wife, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, was in New York, thousands of miles away. The billionaire who had conquered the oceans was drowning in loneliness. How did a man who started as a penniless refugee rise to become the king of the high seas, only to lose every single thing that actually mattered? The story of Aristotle Onassis is not just a tale of money. It is a Greek tragedy written in oil, blood, and tears. If you are ready to uncover the dark, glittering, and heartbreaking true story of the ultimate tycoon, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are about to embark on a journey through the 20th century's most extravagant life and its most devastating fall. To understand the end, we must understand the beginning, because Aristotle Onassis was forged in fire. He was born in 1906 in Smyrna, a cosmopolitan port city that is now Izmir, Turkey. At the time, Smyrna was a jewel of the Aegean, inhabited by a wealthy Greek population. Aristotle's father, Socrates Onassis, was a successful tobacco merchant. The family lived in comfort. Young Aristotle was not a good student. He was a troublemaker, a rebel who preferred swimming in the harbor to sitting in a classroom. But this idyllic life was sitting on a powder keg. In 1922, the world collapsed. The Greco-Turkish War ended in catastrophe for the Greeks. The Turkish army advanced on Smyrna, and the city was set ablaze. This event, known as the Great Fire of Smyrna, was a humanitarian nightmare. Hundreds of thousands of Greeks and Armenians were trapped between the flames and the sea. 16-year-old Aristotle watched as his city burned. He saw neighbors killed and the wealthy reduced to beggars overnight. His father was thrown into prison, accused of conspiring with the enemy. The family's fortune vanished in the smoke. Aristotle, displaying the cunning that would later define his career, managed to save his family. He lied about his age to gain access to officials, bribed guards with the last of their money, and secured passage for his mother and sisters to Greece. He even managed to get his father released from the prison camp. Though their relationship would remain strained forever, Socrates Onassis viewed his son as a failure and a wastrel, a sentiment he made clear even after they were safe. Humiliated, broke, and hungry, Aristotle realized there was no future for him in the refugee camps of Greece. He needed to go where the slate was clean, with a Nansen passport, a document issued to stateless refugees, and less than $250 in his pocket. He boarded a steamer ship bound for Argentina. He traveled in third class, sleeping on the open deck, huddled against the cold winds of the Atlantic. He was alone. He was a nobody. But he had a burning rage inside him, a desperate need to prove his father wrong and to regain the dignity the fire had stolen. In Buenos Aires, the reality was grim. He lived in a cramped boarding house and took the first job he could find, a telephone operator for the British United River Plate Telephone Company. It was grueling work. He worked the night shift, plugging cords into switchboards until his fingers were numb. But Aristotle Onassis did not just work, he listened. He would eavesdrop on the international calls connecting Buenos Aires to New York and London. He listened to businessmen making deals, buying stocks and manipulating markets. He was learning the language of commerce. During the days, while others slept, Aristotle hustled. He noticed that women in Argentina were starting to smoke, influenced by American cinema. However, the local tobacco was harsh. He remembered his father's trade. He knew that mild Turkish tobacco would be a hit. He wrote to his father in Greece, asking him to send samples. His father, still bitter, was reluctant but eventually agreed. Aristotle began rolling cigarettes by hand in his small room, packaging them to look luxurious. He targeted a famous opera singer who was visiting Buenos Aires, charming his way into her dressing room to offer her a specialized blend. She loved them. It was his first marketing coup. Soon, he wasn't just selling cigarettes, he was importing tons of tobacco. By the time he was 25, Aristotle Onassis had made his first $1 million. He had clawed his way out of poverty, but he wasn't satisfied with just being rich. He wanted to be powerful. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought the world to its knees, but for Onassis, it was an opportunity. While global trade ground to a halt, shipping companies were going bankrupt. Massive cargo ships were sitting idle in harbors, rusting away. Everyone said shipping was a dead industry. Onassis saw it differently. He believed that eventually the economy would recover, and when it did, goods would need to move. He traveled to Canada, where a fleet of 10 freighters belonging to a defunct company was being auctioned. These ships had cost $2 million to build. Onassis bought 6 of them for a mere $120,000. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If the depression continued, the maintenance costs would bankrupt him. He was betting his entire tobacco fortune on the ocean. His gamble paid off. As the 1930s progressed and the drums of World War II began to beat, the demand for shipping skyrocketed. Onassis began transporting oil. He was one of the first to realize that the world's thirst for petroleum was insatiable. He commissioned the construction of the world's first supertanker, the Aristotle. He was rewriting the rules of the game. He didn't just use his own money. He mastered the art of using other people's money. He would convince a bank to lend him money to build a ship based on a contract he had with an oil company to lease the ship once it was built. It was a circular flow of credit that allowed him to expand aggressively without liquidating his own cash. By the end of the war, Onassis was a major player, but he was still an outsider. The Greek shipping world was dominated by old families, traditional money. Onassis was seen as a vulgar upstart, a Turk because of his Smyrna origins. To solidify his status, he needed a strategic alliance. He set his sights on Tina Livanos. Tina was the daughter of Stavros Livanos, the patriarch of the Greek shipping industry. She was only 17, beautiful, and possessing the pedigree Onassis lacked. Aristotle was 40, more than twice her age. Stavros Livanos despised Onassis, considering him shady and unstable. But Onassis was relentless. He charmed Tina, and in 1946, they were married. This union was not just a marriage, it was a merger. It signaled to the world that Aristotle Onassis had arrived. However, the marriage also sparked a rivalry that would consume the rest of his life. Another rising shipping tycoon, Stavros Niarchos, had also wanted to marry into the Livanos clan. When Onassis took Tina, Niarchos married her sister, Eugenia. The two men, Onassis and Niarchos, became brothers-in-law, but they were bitter enemies. They competed in everything: who had the biggest ships, the most expensive art, the most famous guests. It was a feud of ego that pushed Onassis to take bigger and bigger risks. In the 1950s, Onassis made a move that shocked the establishment. He decided he wanted a base of operations that matched his grandeur. He didn't just buy a house, he bought a country. Or at least he tried to. He began quietly buying shares in the Société de Bains de Mer, the company that owned the Monte Carlo Casino, the Yacht Club, and the Hôtel de Paris in Monaco. Before long, he owned the controlling interest. He effectively owned the economy of Monaco. This brought him into direct conflict with Prince Rainier, the ruler of Monaco. At first, they were allies, trying to revive the small principality. Onassis even suggested that the prince should marry an American movie star to attract tourism, a piece of advice Rainier took by marrying Grace Kelly. But soon, their visions clashed. Onassis wanted Monaco to be an exclusive playground for the ultra-rich, a haven for his billionaire friends. Rainier wanted to build hotels and apartments for middle-class tourists. The friction became a power struggle. Prince Rainier eventually outmaneuvered Onassis by issuing new shares of the company, diluting Onassis's ownership and forcing him out. It was a stinging public defeat. But if he couldn't own Monaco, he would build a floating city that no prince could touch. He purchased a surplus Canadian frigate and spent $4 million, an astronomical sum in the 1950s, transforming it into the most luxurious private yacht the world had ever seen. He named it the Christina, after his daughter born in 1950. The Christina was not just a boat, it was a floating palace. It had bathrooms fitted with gold faucets and marble tubs. The bar stools were covered in the foreskin of whales, a grotesque display of dominance that Onassis loved to point out to shocked female guests, telling them they were sitting on the most expensive seat in the world. He had an El Greco painting hanging in his study. He had a mosaic swimming pool that could be raised to form a dance floor. The Christina became the epicenter of the international jet set. Winston Churchill was a regular guest, sitting on the deck feeding his pet canary. Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, Elizabeth Taylor, everyone who was anyone came aboard. Onassis was the ringmaster. He was short, heavy-set, with heavy-lidded eyes behind thick glasses, often wearing baggy suits. He wasn't classically handsome, but he radiated power. He was charming, dangerous, and incredibly attentive. When he spoke to you, you felt like the only person in the world. Yet, beneath the champagne and the parties, the foundation of his personal life was rotting. His marriage to Tina was crumbling. He was a serial adulterer, disappearing for days with other women. Tina, young and increasingly unhappy, tried to look the other way, but the humiliation was mounting. Onassis loved his children, Alexander and Christina, but he spoiled them rotten materially while being emotionally distant and demanding. He wanted Alexander to be a clone of himself, a tough businessman, but the boy was sensitive and interested in aviation, not shipping. He doted on Christina but often criticized her appearance, planting the seeds of deep insecurity that would haunt her forever. And then the storm truly broke. In 1959, Onassis met the woman who would match his fire, Maria Callas. Callas was the world's greatest opera soprano, known as La Divina. She was Greek, fiery, talented, and married. When Onassis invited her and her husband onto the Christina for a cruise, the chemistry was explosive. In front of his wife, Tina, and Callas's husband, Onassis began a brazen courtship. The tension on the yacht was unbearable. By the end of the cruise, 2 marriages were destroyed. Tina had had enough. She filed for divorce. The relationship between Onassis and Callas was passionate but toxic. They were the most famous couple in the world. They fought screaming matches in public and made up with diamond necklaces. Callas gave up her career for him, wanting nothing more than to be his wife. But Onassis, having conquered the diva, began to lose interest. He treated her poorly, often mocking her in front of friends. He enjoyed the chase, not the capture. He needed a new trophy, something even more unattainable than the world's greatest singer. But as investigators and biographers were about to find out, this chaotic personal life was only the tip of the iceberg. The true storm was gathering on the horizon, one that would involve the most famous widow in American history, and a tragedy so profound it would shatter the Golden Greek into 1,000,000 pieces. We still have the most chilling evidence of his decline to uncover, so stay tuned. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the life of Aristotle Onassis, make sure you've hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of history. By 1963, Onassis was one of the richest men on earth, but he craved legitimacy. He was still seen by the old money elites of New York and London as a pirate. That year, a tragedy shook the world: the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The world mourned, and the president's widow, Jackie Kennedy, became a figure of almost religious reverence. She was the symbol of American grace and grief. Onassis knew Jackie. He had met her years earlier when she was still a senator's wife. After the assassination, he moved into her orbit, offering her the safety and privacy of his private island, Scorpios. He offered what Jackie needed most: protection. She was terrified for her children, fearing they would be targets. Onassis had the money to build a fortress around them. The courtship was a slow, calculated pursuit. For Onassis, marrying Jackie Kennedy was the ultimate coup. It was a victory over America, over the establishment that had sneered at him. It was the ultimate status symbol. For Jackie, Onassis was an escape hatch from a country that wanted her to remain a grieving widow forever. In October 1968, the news broke, and it was a bombshell. Jackie Kennedy was marrying Aristotle Onassis. The reaction was vitriolic. The American press screamed, "Jackie, oh no!" The headlines called it the marriage of the century, but they meant it as an insult. They said she was marrying a toad for his money. They said he was buying a piece of American history. Maria Callas was devastated. She had waited years for him to marry her, only to learn about his engagement to Jackie from the newspapers. It broke her spirit. The wedding took place on Scorpios. It was a rainy, gloomy affair. From the start, the marriage was a disaster. The cultural clash was immense. Jackie loved art, literature, and quiet. Onassis loved loud bouzouki music, smashing plates, and staying up all night drinking with his cronies. Jackie spent money at a rate that even alarmed Onassis. She would go to New York and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on clothes she never wore, just to fill the emptiness. Onassis began to complain to the press about her spending, calling her the widow. They lived separate lives. He was in Paris or Athens. She was in New York. The protection she sought became a cage. The paparazzi, led by the relentless Ron Galella, hunted her even more ferociously now that she was Jackie O. Onassis, realizing he had bought a trophy that refused to sit on the shelf, grew bitter. He reconnected with Maria Callas, seeking solace in the woman he had discarded. The marriage of the century was a sham. But while the tabloids focused on Jackie, a darker fate was circling the house of Onassis. Aristotle had always been superstitious. He believed that breaking his word or angering the gods would bring retribution. He had hurt many people on his way to the top. He had crushed competitors, discarded lovers, and neglected his children. His son, Alexander, was now a handsome young man in his early 20s. He was the heir apparent. Onassis had placed the entire weight of his legacy on Alexander's shoulders. Alexander was a skilled pilot, finding his only true freedom in the sky. He was also in love with a woman named Fiona Thyssen, a divorced baroness who was 16 years his senior. Onassis hated the relationship. He called Fiona a gold digger and threatened to disinherit Alexander if he didn't leave her. The father and son were at war. On Monday, January 22, 1973, Alexander Onassis arrived at the Hellenican Airport in Athens. He was scheduled to check out a new pilot for the company's amphibious plane, a Piaggio 136. The plane had been serviced recently. Alexander, meticulous as always, took the pilot's seat. The new pilot sat beside him, and a mechanic sat in the back. The weather was clear. Alexander taxied to the runway. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane gathered speed. It lifted off the tarmac. But immediately, something went wrong. The plane banked sharply to the right. It failed to gain altitude. In a matter of seconds, gravity reclaimed the machine. The Piaggio crashed onto the runway, cartwheeling in a ball of metal and dust. The mechanic and the co-pilot survived with injuries. Alexander was found in the wreckage, critically injured with massive brain trauma. He was rushed to the Cat Hospital in Athens. Aristotle was in New York when the call came. It is the sound every parent fears, the ringing telephone that divides life into before and after. He flew immediately to Athens, bringing the best neurosurgeons in the world with him. Jackie flew in as well. For days, they waited. The doctors operated, but the damage was catastrophic. Alexander was brain dead. His body was being kept alive by machines. Aristotle Onassis, the man who could buy countries, the man who could bend governments to his will, stood by the bedside of his son and realized he was powerless. He refused to believe it. He threatened the doctors. He demanded miracles. But there are no miracles in the neurology ward. Finally, the doctors told him there was no hope. They asked for permission to disconnect the life support. Onassis could not bring himself to say the words. He stood over his son, looking at the tubes and wires. The heir to the empire, the future of the name, was gone. Eventually, he nodded. Alexander Onassis died on January 23, 1973. He was 24 years old. When Alexander died, Aristotle Onassis died with him. The light went out of his eyes. The man who had been a force of nature turned into a ghost. He refused to bury Alexander in a traditional cemetery. He had him interred on Scorpios, next to the small chapel. Aristotle would spend hours there, sitting by the grave, talking to the dirt. He would bring a bottle of ouzo and pour a glass for himself, and one onto the grave for his son. The grief drove him into madness. He became convinced the crash was not an accident. He believed Alexander had been murdered by his enemies, perhaps the CIA or business rivals. He offered a $1 million reward for information proving sabotage. He hired private investigators who found that the cables controlling the plane's ailerons had been reversed during maintenance, a seemingly impossible mistake for a qualified mechanic to make accidentally. But no proof of a plot was ever definitively found. It remained an open wound. The tragedy compounded. In 1974, his first wife, Tina, the mother of his children, was found dead in a hotel room in Paris. The official cause was pulmonary edema, but rumors of an overdose swirled. Tina had never recovered from the loss of her son. Within 2 years, Onassis had lost his son and the mother of his children. His daughter Christina was spiraling into depression and substance abuse. Onassis's health began to fail rapidly. The stress triggered a dormant condition, myasthenia gravis, a neuromuscular disease that causes severe muscle weakness. It started with his eyes. The muscles controlling his eyelids failed. He had to tape them open with medical tape just to see. The image of the once swaggering Tycoon, now frail, with taped open eyes, was a horrific symbol of his fall. He had seen too much, and now his body was refusing to look at the world. He lost weight rapidly. His heart grew weak. He was in constant pain. Jackie was rarely there. She remained in New York, which only fueled the public perception that she was cold and unfeeling. In reality, the marriage had been over long before the illness. Onassis was actually drafting divorce papers. He was trying to rewrite his will to minimize what Jackie would inherit. He felt she brought him bad luck. He called her the witch. In early 1975, Onassis collapsed in Athens. He was flown to the American hospital in Paris. This was the end. The doctors knew it. He knew it. Christina, his daughter, was by his side. She was the only one left. She was 24, the same age Alexander had been when he died. She was terrified. She was about to inherit an empire she wasn't prepared for, carrying the weight of a name that seemed cursed. Jackie eventually flew to Paris, but she reportedly spent much of the time visiting art galleries and dining out, anticipating the end, but maintaining her distance. The press camped outside the hospital, waiting for the inevitable. The vultures were circling. On March 15, 1975, the struggle ended. Aristotle Onassis took his final breath. He was 69 years old. He died of respiratory failure, a complication of his disease. But really, he died of a broken heart. The aftermath of his death was a spectacle of greed and legal warfare. The reading of the will was a battlefield. Onassis had left the bulk of his estate to Christina. and he had established a foundation in Alexander's name. But he had tried to limit Jackie's share. Jackie, however, was not one to walk away empty-handed. She entered into a bitter legal battle with Christina. The press feasted on the conflict, the Greek versus the widow. In the end, Christina, desperate to end the fighting and rid herself of her stepmother, agreed to a settlement. Jackie walked away with $26 million. It was a fortune, but a fraction of the total Onassis wealth. Christina Onassis became the richest woman in the world. But the Onassis curse was not done. She inherited her father's empire, but also his profound unhappiness. She married and divorced 4 times. She struggled with her weight and pill addiction. She was constantly searching for the love her father had never properly given her. In 1988, at the age of 37, Christina was found dead in a bathtub in Buenos Aires, the very city where her father had started his climb 60 years earlier. The circle of tragedy was complete. Today, the island of Scorpios, once the private kingdom of the Onassis family, has been sold to a Russian billionaire. The grave of Aristotle Alexander and Christina remains there, a quiet corner on a piece of land that no longer belongs to their bloodline. The story of Aristotle Onassis is a warning. It is a testament to the fact that ambition can build empires, but it cannot buy peace. He conquered the world's oceans. He amassed billions. He married the most famous woman on earth. But in the end, he was a man taping his eyes open, staring into the dark, wishing for one more conversation with his son. He was the billionaire who had it all, and yet, in the most important ways, he had nothing. The Golden Greek serves as a reminder that the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes, and the harder the fall. His life was a blaze of glory that burned everyone close to him, leaving behind only ash and cautionary tales. Thank you for watching this full video into the life and fall of Aristotle Onassis. What do you think was his biggest mistake? Was it the pursuit of Jackie Kennedy, the pressure he put on his son, or simply the hubris of believing he could outrun fate? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please share it. I'll see you in the next video.